The question is whether you agree or disagree with today's motion. And as you're all aware, the motion is the next US administration should reassure China, not just deter it. While you vote, let me outline what we are debating today. The conflict between the United States and China is certainly a key feature of our time, which will influence the shape of the world to come. Over the past 12 months, following the meeting between US President Biden and Chinese President Xi at the APEC summit, relationship has stabilized, albeit on a relatively low level. But managing the relationship with China will be a key priority for the next US administration, whomever will lead it. And one very crucial aspect of this is to think about reassurance versus deterrence. The case for deterring China from a US perspective is clear. The US government wants to prevent China from doing certain things, like, for example, taking Taiwan by force, or developing or acquiring key technologies, or supplying weapons to countries like Russia. Sanctions, military assistance, or threat thereof can offer deterrence. But the question is whether deterrence should not be coupled with forms of more reassuring policy. For example, clearly signaling Beijing that the US still sees scope for collaboration in various issues and that it ultimately accepts a stronger and more influential China. This is a very tricky balance for any administration to achieve, and today's discussion will explore how the next US administration should go about it. Thank you very much for your votes. I will close the poll now. Excellent. Thank you very much. Now it's time for me to introduce the teams that will debate today, and I'm asking all panelists to turn on their videos, their cameras and audio so we can see them. On the side arguing in favor of today's motion, we have Rorry Daniels, who is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Previously, she was with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, where she focused on Taiwan, US-China relations, and the North Korean nuclear program. Joining her on the side of the team arguing in favor of the motion is Yun Sun, who is a senior fellow and director of the China program at the Stimson Center, with strong expertise in Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries. On the side arguing against the motion is James Crabtree, who is currently the Toy Senior Fellow at both the Asia Society Switzerland and Asia Society Policy Institute. He's the former executive director of IISS Asia, where he oversaw the Shangri-La Dialogue. Joining him on the side arguing against the motion is Jason Su, who is a senior advisor at Liquid AI and a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He also served as a legislator at large at Taiwan's national parliament. Thank you all very much for being here. As is customary, the first opening statement goes to the team arguing in favor of the motion, and that is going to be delivered by Rorry Daniels. So without much further ado, Rorry, you have 4 minutes on the clock for your opening statements arguing in favor of today's motions and the case for reassurance of China.
Thank you, Nico, and welcome everyone to this debate. I would like to argue that reassurance is an essential component of an effective China policy for the United States. And first, we really have to define what reassurance is and what it isn't. Reassurance is a shared conviction that the two largest economies in the world, economies that are incredibly interdependent on each other, have more to gain by cooperating and collaborating on shared problems and managing differences through dialogue than we have to gain by managing our differences through force, coercion, or conflict. It's really just a restatement of long-term US policy goals that we welcome a peaceful China to participate meaningfully in the international system and in the region. And this is what the countries in the region want between the US and China. They really want to be able to make choices independently of a US-China strategic competition that's devolving into conflict and confrontation. Reassurance is not capitulation to China or any other country to prioritize its interests over our own, nor is it appeasement of the elements of China's behavior that the US finds both disturbing and destabilizing. Reassurance is instead a very powerful tool for diplomacy. It can set an appropriate floor underneath the relationship so that the stakes of conflict are higher, and it can facilitate meaningful official communication and engagement. That is indeed what we've seen between the US and China over the past year, and really stretching back to the year before when President Xi and President Biden met in Bali. Diplomacy is an art. It's not a science. It's the art of persuasion. And this means that the mood that you set in order to have these engagements really matters. You know, if you've ever sat down to have a tough conversation with someone, and believe me, between the US and China, there are many difficult conversations that are going on and need to be going on. Think about how you would prep and how you would feel if your partner in that discussion had their full force and power trained on you in a hostile manner. You would be in an extremely defensive position. You would be threatened. You would perhaps be unable to imagine a future where compromise was possible. So setting the tone and mood to get what the US wants from China has to be done in good faith negotiation. And Reassurance provides us with the good faith platform to do this. Reassurance can also be applied to larger, more existential questions about how the US wants to see China's role in the world. In fact, I'd argue that it is absolutely essential for a reassurance strategy to define a peaceful coexistence between the US and China, where problems can be negotiated rather than solved by conflict or forced projection. Again, this is the relationship that the rest of the world wants to see the US and China have, because the stakes are incredibly high for the global economy and for global peace and prosperity, including how we manage the upcoming clean energy transition so that we can all survive as humans in the 21st century despite global warming. With that, I invite you to consider reassurance an essential part of a China strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rorry. Incredible precision here on the timing. You ended exactly when the clock hit 0. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to pass it right along to the team arguing against the motion, where James Crabtree will deliver the opening statement from London. James, the floor is yours for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you to Rorry. Thank you to the Asia Society. Let me try and make 4 points in the 4 minutes that our side has been allotted. I mean, the first of which is about the context in which we're having this discussion, which is fundamentally about Trump versus Harris. I was in Beijing earlier this year, and I got the sense from Chinese interlocutors that there was real indecision in China as to whether Trump, or at that point Biden, now Harris, would be better for China's self-interest. You know, pros and cons on each side. Trump is more chaotic, Biden-Harris more predictable. But I think it's a fair assumption that whoever wins, US-China relations will deteriorate in the aftermath of the election, of the US election. We've been in an unusual period of stability, in part because of other global crises, and in part because of the happy circumstances that led both the US and China, temporarily at least, to pause their more competitive instincts. But I don't think that's very likely to last. In a sense, if President Trump wins, it's very clear that he is going to go after China economically. And even if President Harris were to emerge in January, then there's a lot of pent-up demand within the US system for more competitive measures that have been put on hold during the course of this year. So that's the context we're talking about. And therefore, the argument that we're having is, what is the right balance of deterrence and reassurance? I don't think anyone is arguing that you want only military action or only dialogue. It's, are we doing enough of one or the other? And on our side, we're arguing that predominantly what you have to do is deter, because reassurance, although it sounds nice, isn't going to work very well. Now, why do we think that? I think it is fair to say that a pure deterrent strategy is not ideal. This is what political scientists call the problem of the security dilemma, in which if one side adds more weapons, then the other side will feel threatened and will add more weapons in turn, and you get a kind of downward spiral that you can never pull out of. Nonetheless, the debate that has been happening over the last 6 months about this relative balance is a sophisticated one. There has been plenty of reassurance going on under the Biden administration, and that is why you've had some modest success through the various channels that have been set up by the administration between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi, between the two respective commerce ministers, between the Treasury Minister and her interlocutor. And the US has restated its basic position, for instance, which is that under the right circumstances, the US would not object to Taiwan reintegration with the mother country. But I think at base, we want to make two arguments. I mean, the first is that reassurance with China is particularly difficult because China and the US are in such a low trust equilibrium. The US position on issues like Taiwan may not be changing officially from the administration, but it is changing in Congress. It is changing in some intellectual quarters. And really, China doesn't believe that the US policy is what it says it is, and therefore reassurance doesn't work very effectively. The second, and really the core point, is that China isn't really seeking reassurance. As Rorry said, China feels insecure within its own neighborhood. It doesn't see the status quo, the rules-based international order, as legitimate. It feels constrained, and it seeks greater strategic space within its own region and potentially beyond it. And the evidence is that reassuring autocracies in this sort of situation is not likely to succeed. I mean, it didn't succeed.
Gonna have to slowly.
It didn't succeed for President Putin. It isn't going to succeed for President Xi. And that's why the next US administration should focus predominantly on deterrence to achieve its aims.
Thank you very much, James. Crabtree. I'm going to pass it again right back to the team arguing in favor of the motion. Yunsun from Stimson Center with her rebuttal. Again, you have 4 minutes on the clock to argue in favor of today's motion.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you very much. It sounds like James agrees with us that it's not just about deterrence. That reassurance is an inevitable and is indispensable component of the U.S. strategy towards China. Thank you, James. In terms of our rebuttal, I think there are primarily 2 points that I would like to raise. The first one is James mentioned that it's difficult to reassure. Well, like Rorry said, diplomacy is an art, right? Well, it's difficult doesn't mean it cannot be done or it shouldn't be done. I think in the broader scheme of avoiding conflict and also responsibly managing this relationship, some level of reassurance, not just deterrence, is a must for the U.S. policy. And secondly, while China doesn't want to be reassured, I think that's a very broad statement. I think it depends on the issue. On issues such as Taiwan, I think China is definitely looking for reassurance. On the issue of global order or the regional security architecture, I think it's a bargaining process. There are pros and cons. There's going to be diplomatic negotiation as for what it looks like. But I wouldn't just make a blank statement that China cannot be and does not want to be reassured. I think the Chinese search for reassurance from the United States has been quite conspicuous, especially under the Biden administration. Just to re-emphasize on some of the points that we want to make, all policies are a combination of reassurance and deterrence. Both are aimed at preventing war and managing the relationship. Given the conflicting interests and world visions between US and China, any strategy to deal with China must come from a position of strength. Hence, deterrence, at least before there could be a mutually agreed consensus between US and China about the coexistence. We are in uncharted territory in terms of US-China relations. It took US and Soviet Union more than 2 decades, even after the Cuban Missile Crisis, to establish the basic rules of coexistence, and we're far from being there between US and China. So therefore, a strategy purely based on either deterrence or reassurance is unlikely to render the desired result. So during this particularly unstable stage, it is important to utilize all policy tools and keep our options open while we probe boundaries of this strategic competition. The challenge is, well, if you look at reassurance versus deterrence, I think the joke in the field is reassurance is a bottomless bucket, and deterrence is in the eyes of the beholder. So neither alone shows China an endgame that it can aspire for, which leads to the unintended and undesired consequences. So with reassurance, we could say that yes, China may simply not believe that the US goal is benevolent and peaceful, as we have seen in many of the articulations from China. And we could also argue that reassurance alone will cultivate emboldenment. But the problem with a strategy of pure deterrence is much more significant. It cultivates arms race, as China will not be deterred forever. It will only add to the momentum of military modernization and nuclear buildup. We have had that experience during the Cold War. And a strategy of pure deterrence is also a self-fulfilling prophecy. As China responds in kind, the relationship will become even more hostile and more adversarial. So it helps from the US domestic point of view because it will help to forge national consensus and eliminating dissenting views. But the bad news is that the two countries will be locked in an escalatory downward spiral and there's no exit. The problem with a strategy of pure deterrence also doesn't offer us a vision of victory, because China is not a country that will go away. Even if deterrence or the arms race collapses Chinese economy like it did with the Soviet Union, China will remain a geopolitical threat because of its history, because of its geopolitical significance and its weight, just like Russia has remained a geopolitical threat. Rorry has talked about how a strategy of pure deterrence is prone to conflict. I will raise one last point, because a strategy of pure deterrence without reassurance will lose the opportunity to shape China's behavior and China's strategy. If China believes there is still room to coexist with the US, its desire to challenge it will be much significantly reduced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yun. And before we move to the final rebuttal from the team arguing against the motion, let me just quickly remind the audience that now is a very good time to start submitting your questions that you want to put to any of the panelists using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. We're going to be moving into Q&A after this rebuttal. Q&A is relatively short for these conversations, so the sooner you get your question in, the higher the chance that we will be able to answer it. And with that, I'm passing the word to Jason, who's joining us from Singapore, where it is late at night, for his final rebuttal arguing against today's motion. Jason, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
Great, thank you, Nicole. History has shown that the peace is often maintained not through appeasement, but through strength and credible assurance. The U.S. military in the Indo-Pacific has been a cornerstone of regional stability for decades, preventing conflicts and ensuring freedom of navigation in international waters. Without strong deterrence, reassurance becomes a hollow gesture. Only when China perceives that its aggressive actions will have tangible costs can meaningful dialogue on issues such as climate change or trade or our Taiwan issues on equal footing. Those in favor of reassurance argue that collaboration on global issues like climate change will reduce tensions. However, China's track record on global collaboration shows that it tends to pursue its own interests rather than global public goods unless pressured. For example, China's promise on climate change have often lagged behind actions, such as continued investments on coal plants domestically and abroad. Any diplomatic efforts or reassurances must be backed by strong deterrence mechanisms to ensure China takes U.S. concerns seriously. Secondly, deterrence does not preclude diplomacy. Deterrence and reassurance are not mutually exclusive. They can and should be complementary. Deterrence sets the boundaries within which diplomacy can effectively operate. By showing strength, the U.S. creates space for negotiations that don't undermine its own security interests or those of its allies. A well-calibrated deterrence strategy doesn't mean a constant escalation, but a clear communication of red lines, particularly on issues such as Taiwan and the freedom of navigation in South China Sea. As someone from Taiwan, I would use Taiwan as the primary example why deterrence does not escalate conflict, it prevents it. Supporters of reassurance might argue that strong deterrence risk provoking China and could lead to heightened tension or even conflict. However, history often proves otherwise. It is often the weak deterrence that invites aggression, as it leaves room for miscalculation. A credible deterrent posture, clearly communicated, is more likely to prevent misinterpretation of U.S. intentions. In recent years, China has dramatically ramped up its military activities near Taiwan, including frequent incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. These activities are part of China's broader strategy to intimidate Taiwan, exert psychological pressure on our own government and citizens, and demonstrates capacity for forcefully reunify Taiwan with mainland if necessary. Reassurance will not address China's military buildup or reduce the threat of an invasion. Only strong deterrence, including U.S. support for Taiwan's defense capabilities, can prevent China from taking more aggressive military steps. China has repeatedly called for peaceful unification with Taiwan, promoting it under the same one country, two system model used in Hong Kong. However, it is seen by Taiwan that as a deceptive strategy that would ultimately erode its democratic freedoms and sovereignty, as evidenced by Hong Kong experience. Reassuring China on Taiwan issue without a credible deterrent would likely be interpreted as weakness, leading China to intensify its pressure on Taiwan by relying on assurance such as military preparedness, international diplomatic support, and clear U.S. security commitments. Taiwan can resist coercion and maintain its de facto independence. Beyond military threats, China has consistently used economic coercion to pressure Taiwan and other countries that engage with Taiwan. For instance, China has restricted Taiwan business from operating in China or banned imports from Taiwan during the times of political tension. This
I'm going to have to slowly
to hurt Taiwan's
get to an
economy
end
and isolate it internationally, especially by pressuring countries to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Jason. And that concludes the first part of today's debate, and we're moving into Q&A and discussion. We've many questions coming in already. Thank you for those. Quick reminder also that you can see the questions that have already been submitted. If you like one that's already there, you can upvote it, and that will tell us that we should address this question with higher urgency. I want to ask a first question to the team arguing in favor of the motion. Rorry, I'm going to put this question to you. I think one of the strongest arguments from the opposing team really is the question of trust. And you have described diplomacy as the art of persuasion. It's a very nice image that you've drawn up for us, but it's striking to me that any sort of dialogue, any sort of persuasion ultimately relies on a basic underlying trust. And I think the opposing team makes a really good case here that that trust, if not fully eroded, has just become very weak. So how is reassurance possible if both sides very fundamentally don't trust the opposite side's intentions?
Thank you, and apologize for my hand waving. My lights just went out, but we'll live with that. So I think that the key element here is that we simply cannot have any trust at all without some reassurances. We've certainly seen situations in which the U.S. went so far into deterrence strategy that it was not able to, commit to some of the components of that strategy, including that it needs to involve clear communication of what the intentions are. Reassurances can provide that. I also would just take this moment to underscore that both sides are asking each other for reassurances, and that's a stabilizing factor in the U.S.-China relationship. It is not the case that China does not seek reassurances from the United States. It's seeking reassurances that the United States does not seek to undermine its political system. It's seeking reassurances that the United States does not intend to constrain China's economic rise. And it's seeking reassurances that the U.S. will not provoke on some of China's critical core interests, the major one being on the sovereignty issue of Taiwan. So I think reassurance definitely has a place, even if trust is underdeveloped. We've seen what happens when there's no trust and no reassurances, right? That was the case that we had in the 2018 to 2022 period. At the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration, And there was simply no way for the US-China relationship to kind of arrest deterioration and damage that is still being repaired. So I think that there are many different ways to provide reassurances. There are many different ways to structure those reassurances to the kind of negotiating partner that you are seeking to influence. And simply saying that, you know, because we can't trust each other, we can't have reassurances, simply it just misses the mark of international communication and diplomacy.
Thank you very much, Rorry. Turning it to the team that has argued against the motion, James Crabtree, you have spent many years of your life in Singapore, where you've ran the Shangri-La Dialogue, which brought together defense ministers and leading voices from around the region. And it seems to me that Rorry, in her opening statement, really had a good point when she said that reassurance, active diplomatic dialogue, constructive collaboration on some of the issues, this is what the countries in the region want. So is it not true that, you know, an increased focus on deterrence and on conflict is just not in the interest of the region at large?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting point. I think there's some truth to it. I think if you go to Southeast Asia, where I used to live and where Jason is this evening, that's true, that basically the median, beyond the Philippines, the median voting country in Southeast Asia does want de-escalation and dialogue, and it doesn't like seeing escalation. But I don't think it's true in much of the rest of the region. It's definitely not true in Japan, probably not true in Australia, probably not true in India. Jason can speak for Taiwan, so I think the region is divided between, and those countries that feel most threatened by China are most suspicious of the kind of reassurance-led diplomacy that you saw in the second Obama term, in which you know, there wasn't really a focus on deterring China, and China took advantage of that, for instance, in its island-building campaign in the South China Sea. I also wanted to pick up on very quickly on something which Yun Sun said, which I thought was interesting about China's military buildup, which I think is a good point to raise. And I guess in response, I would say, can we imagine a situation in which China's military buildup would stop? As in, is there a level of reassurance that could be provided which would stop China deciding that it wanted to radically expand its nuclear capabilities, for instance, or to sort of cease its development of long-range anti-ship missiles? I think it's very hard to imagine. I mean, and I think that supports our fundamental point, which is that China isn't really, it may say it wants reassurance, but there isn't really any quantity of reassurance which is going to stop China's fundamental strategy of modernizing its military and becoming a more dominant force in East Asia.
Thank you very much. And there are so many good questions coming in from the audience that I'm going to start picking some questions from there already, just to make sure we can get through as many of them as possible. Yun, I'm going to ask you the first question coming from the audience, which says, you know, that, and I think everybody here on this call would agree, is that the US has clearly increased efforts to deter China in recent years. Can you provide any specific examples of US efforts to reassure Beijing that would not or do not undermine deterrence? So what are very concrete examples of, you know, sort of, forms of reassurance that would actually not weaken the deterrence stance?
Thank you. Great question. Well, I think this question actually can be viewed from the lens of Taiwan, right? Our argument is not that US policy should just be reassurance. We're saying that it should not just be deterrence. And reassurance will have to be an element of the US grand strategy towards China, without which we believe it will lead to almost an inevitability of confrontation and escalation of tension. And on the issue of Taiwan, well, Jason made a point that US deterrence has been most effective to stop the Chinese from taking risky behaviors towards Taiwan. I think the counter-argument is it deters until it doesn't. And I think it is a risk of it doesn't that we cannot afford here. That the question about what examples that we have in terms of US providing reassurance without damaging the credibility of deterrence is very well reflected on Taiwan. I think U.S. have strengthened defense cooperation, defense support, our political, economic, and diplomatic support of Taiwan in the past number of years, especially under the under the Trump administration and also under the Biden administration. But at the same time, I would say under the Biden administration, we're also seeing that U.S. trying to reassure Taiwan that trying to reassure mainland China that U.S. policy is not about supporting Taiwan independence. And U.S. eventually does not support one China, one Taiwan. And I think that reassurance has been important, at least on the diplomatic and political level for Beijing, that it does not need to resort to a military risky behavior towards Taiwan because Beijing might believe that all hope for unification is lost. So I think we are dealing with very precise or very, we're dealing with precise calculus here. That the answer is not yes or no, that yes, there's trust or no, there's no trust. We are dealing with a lot of ambiguity, unfortunately, but in that process, leaving all the options open and utilize all tools, including deterrence and reassurance, is inevitable for an effective policy towards China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jason, turning to you, there was a piece in Foreign Affairs a few months ago written by Matt Pottinger, who was serving the Trump administration, which, and I'm sort of simplifying here, but the pieces have effectively argued that the US didn't have to manage its competition with China, it had to win it. And my sense is that your deterrence first argument kind of like rests very much on the idea that this is a competition that can be won. Now, I think there would be many people who would dispute that notion. That this is a competition between two large powers, neither of which is going to go away anytime soon. So isn't a deterrence approach, as you and James are promoting it, effectively doomed to fail? Because neither side will lose, neither side can lose, neither side is prepared to lose. And managing the competition is the only way to go, and that requires strong reassurance.
I agree in principle with what you said, Nico, but I think there are nuances that to be investigated and studied. And from Taiwan's perspective, the lessons to us are incredibly clear. China's actions, whether military intimidation, economic coercion, diplomatic isolation, or broken promises in Hong Kong, demonstrated that reassurance alone will not be enough to protect Taiwan's sovereignty and domestic democratic values. And this also plays to our domestic politics dynamic as well. And what we are dealing here are essentially three things. Number one is, does China do what it says? Oftentimes it says one thing and does the other. And the same thing that it deals with Taiwan, it deals with US and deals with other countries. It says in one way, it welcomes Taiwanese businessmen to do business in China, but it banned the imports of agricultural goods and fish. And secondly, we need to truly understand what kind of leader Xi Jinping is. And you have to understand from reading his words, his speeches, and the way that he put Taiwan issue as centuries of humiliation. And he wanted to resolve this issue as his legacy. So for Taiwan, we have to prepare for the worst. And that is why we can no longer operate in the water of ambiguity. And for the last 30 years, the ambiguity works well because US is trying to engage with China, and the whole world is engaging with China too. And Taiwan obviously, is benefited from this engagement as well, commercially, and perhaps we call that political dividends when US and China are getting along. But that is no longer the trend. And so we have to prepare for the worst. And thirdly, the microscope of a Taiwan and China relation is actually the projection of the US-China relations. Currently, US-China relations is at a very low trust, and the erosion of this already very low trust is getting larger and larger by day. So for Taiwan, we really have to prepare for ourselves and relying on reassuring China and through other people's agency, which is US, is not going to help Taiwan ultimately. And thirdly, I wanted to stress the fact that we're not talking about purely fighting China or deterring China with hard power, because nobody would believe that would be successful. I'm talking about reassurance backed by credible deterrence. So far, there hasn't been a strong deterrent that China is willing to believe that if it attempts to move against Taiwan, that the pain and the cost it would inflict on itself would be the final day of reckoning of Xi Jinping. So I think that's the important understanding we must have as we are at the front line dealing with these credible threats on a daily basis, both economically, diplomatically, and militarily.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rorry, this is obviously a conversation about what the next US administration is supposed to be doing, but I'm recording this here from Europe. James is in London. So in a way, it seems to me reassurance is very similar to this policy that many European countries have pursued towards China, which is usually labeled as change through trade, with the idea that we would reassure China that it could develop its economy if it played by the rules. And I think there's almost universal agreement by now in Europe that this policy has spectacularly failed. So what does this mean with regards to this sort of more conciliatory approach that you're arguing for? This is a strategy that sounded really good on paper, but it just did not achieve the goals that it set out to achieve.
Sure. Well, I think that it's a bit of a conflation between two policies. One was about like what kind of relationship do countries want to have with China? The other is about reassurances, meaning reassurances that there is a peaceful place for China in the world. Again, sometimes backed by deterrent. It's clear that any goal of changing another country deserves additional scrutiny, but I don't think that's actually the goal of reassurance. Reassurance was never meant to change China. It was simply meant to welcome China into the international system. If China doesn't play by the rules, there are certainly ways for the US and other countries to counteract those behaviors. And that is what the US and the other countries of the world are doing. But does that mean that we want to see a China that is like isolated, economically broken, and therefore really unstable? I think not. I think there's a middle ground here between setting a dress code for behavior in the international system and reassuring China that it can be a part of that system if it plays by the rules, if it dresses appropriately. I think on other points, inconsistencies in how countries treat other countries are very common across foreign policy. I mean, Jason gave some excellent examples of where China has been inconsistent in its Taiwan policy. I could give you 50 other examples of where the US has been quite inconsistent in its policies. We don't treat other authoritarian countries, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, others, the same way that we treat China. And that is to say, we are much more willing to provide reassurances that we don't have a hostile intent with those countries, regardless of their political system. I mean, this all plays into Xi Jinping's calculus for what he needs to do to maintain Chinese political legitimacy. But I would argue that we are not at a point where Chinese political legitimacy is completely divorced from Chinese leadership's understanding and handling of the US-China relationship. I think reassurances allow Xi Jinping to move, the defensiveness of China against the United States down a couple of notches so he can focus on other issues and other problems. And that allows China to think that time is on their side. And having time on your side is a great way to prevent ultimate conflict, which would be destructive to the US-China, the global economy, and the entire world.
Thank you so much. In this debate, time is not entirely on our side, and we're already slowly running out of time for the Q&A. There's one question. There's so many questions left from the audience. There's one question I still want to pick up because I think it raises an important point by saying is that reassurance and deterrence can both be, part of a mix to achieve a certain policy, but is asking, well, what either team actually sees as the ultimate policy goal here. I know that's a broad question for 2 remaining minutes. And so I'm going to quickly, slightly rephrase it. James Crabtree, very quick answer from your team. If the next US administration actually does what you think it should do, how will we know that the policy was successful 4 years later? What are the markers of success that we should look towards if the next US administration has a focus on deterrence?
Right. I think I could mention the name of the august former Asia Society chair, Kevin Rudd, who I once asked, in a sense, isn't what you're proposing, Mr. Rudd, kind of kicking the can down the road? And he said, candidly, yes, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with trying to hold on to the status quo, because often the other options are worse. And so I think the reason why the aim of deterrence isn't to, kind of edge towards some kind of military conflict. It is to wait for a change in circumstances in China, not necessarily what has been called in the US public sphere a regime change, but it may be that in 5 or 10 years that the Chinese Communist Party system reverts away from the model that it has taken under President Xi to one that is, more cooperative, more plural within the Chinese context, and in which China's behavior in the international system moderates. So I think that is really what we're talking about here. And the question is, on what timescale will that plausibly happen? It could take a long time, but then the first Cold War took a long time to resolve itself as well.
Thank you very much. Yun, I just want to very briefly put the same question to you. It seems that kicking the can down the road as a policy goal could be something that that could also be what your team agrees with. Is that what you would say as well? How would the US administration measure its success if it followed your reassurance first advice?
Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily kick the can down the road, because that suggests a static state of policy, right? But in reality, the US policy towards China and also the interaction between US and China is a dynamic process. What we're looking at, if George Kennan called it 7 decades ago, is a test of national quality. So in my view, the goal of the US policy, it should be the result of the process rather than the origin of the process, because what will be revealed as China's national quality, that will depend on how China will react, the resilience of the Chinese state and the Chinese society, and also the quality and resilience of the US government and US society, right? So what we're looking at essentially is whether it is coexistence in the end, it does not depend on our definition of the vision. We cannot define an end game from the beginning of the game, because we're not at the end of the game. We are at the beginning of the game. So the definition of that game will be reviewed in that competition process. It cannot be proclaimed by that process of competition. So it also eventually, it depends on how much China can endure and how much US can endure. But I would say that one criteria that we should use to evaluate the success of the policy is, well, let's look at China's behavior. Are China more cooperative on issues that we deem as our national priority? For example, on the issue of fentanyl, on the issue of law enforcement, is China behaving more responsibly in that process, or China is being driven to the other side and act like Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's high time now that we move to closing statements, where each panelist gets 2 minutes to make a final case for their argument. The order is the same as in the beginning, which means that Rorry Daniels, arguing in favor of the motion, gets to start. Rorry, you have 2 minutes on the clock for your closing statement.
Thank you. So I just want to reiterate what I said in the beginning. Reassurance puts a floor on the US-China relationship. And trust me, we want a floor on the US-China relationship. As others have pointed out, these are 2 countries with very modern or modernizing militaries. There are areas, including over territory, where militaries are traditionally used in order to press forward on territorial claims. We do not want to be in a situation to start where the US and China have decided that diplomacy is a losing strategy, and therefore the only way forward is to prosecute our cases through military means. We must have a floor under the relationship to do that, and that's what reassurance does. Similarly, I think that one of the reasons that our team is arguing in favor of reassurance is that the US policy community has swung so far in the other direction towards pure deterrence that reassurance has become, like almost a dirty word. Again, it's been mistaken for capitulation. It's been mistaken for giving China favors in the absence of getting anything in return. But as my colleague Yoon just pointed out, there are many reasons that the US and China need to work together to advance US priorities and interests, including dealing with fentanyl, including stabilizing the global economy, working towards climate change and other things. We know that China does react to reassurances. We know that mood matters when it comes to sitting down with the Chinese. We know that ultimately a lot of the decisions in China are made by very few people. Those should be the people that we're targeting for these reassurances. So a reassurance strategy does not mean the absence of deterrence. It simply means, hey, we have other tools in our toolkit, in order to persuade China to advance US interests. We should be using them. If you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Let's broaden out that toolkit a little bit, set the floor under the relationship, and see how far things can be taken.
Thank you very much, Rorry. I'm going to pass it right on to James Crabtree for final statements arguing against today's motion. James.
Thanks, Nico. And thank you to all of the fellow participants in this debate. I think it's been a rich and very useful discussion. I admire the optimism of the opposing side. I rather wish that I thought we lived in a world in which a greater focus on diplomacy would solve some of the fundamental structural issues that we face in the US-China bilateral, or for instance, in the US-India, or in the China-India or China-Japan bilateral. But I fear that the risk is that we're avoiding some very basic points. I'll just make two of them. The first is, as we have argued, that China doesn't, it may say it seeks reassurance, as we've argued, but really what China wants is an improved balance of power in its own favor, an improved regional position. Jason said regional dominance. It would like to be the dominant power in East Asia in the same way that the United States is the dominant power in its own hemisphere. There's nothing wrong with that. It's quite a logical position for a great power to take. There are many advantages that come with that. And again, it's not just the United States. If you speak to people in Delhi or Tokyo, this is the fear that they have. This is the behavior that China is exerting. And the thing that is most likely to stop that is the hard power balance. The thing that will deter China from, at some point, seeking a military solution to Taiwan is the military balance in the region, just as it was in the Cold War, the military balance between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and on this occasion, the military balance between China and the US and its allies. And it's for that reason that I wasn't even a great fan of what the US calls integrated deterrence, the idea that you bring together all of these different parts of the US system of systems of national power. What really matters is old-fashioned hard power. And unfortunately, I think the risk is that if you focus too much on reassurance, then you lose track of that fundamental reality of the messages that China really hears.
Thank you very much, James Crabtree. Yoon-sun, your final 2 minutes arguing in favor of the motion, please.
Thank you, Chair. Rorry and we're not optimistic at all. The China problem does not have a solution. That's a problem. It can only be managed. It is one of those problems. And we talked about trust. I would say that trust is not a goal of US policy towards China. Trust is a tool. The goal of the US policy is to manage China to maximize US national interest while avoid conflict. Eventually, reassurance may not build the strategic trust that our colleagues have been arguing about, but it can build a floor. And the floor is to avoid war. When we talk about US-China relations, war prevention is about the lowest common denominator that everyone can also agree. Reassurance also helps to build tactical cooperation, even if it does not change China's strategic ambition. But tactical cooperation on specific issues are still important while we pursue a competitive strategy. Neither deterrence nor reassurance alone will be sufficient for an effective China policy. Deterrence without reassurance is a recipe for arms race and escalation of tension, and potentially the inevitability of a conflict. Reassurance without deterrence will produce emboldenment, encourage Chinese assertiveness, and potentially cause miscalculation. That's why both are needed. China is a country that understands power. Deterrence is a must to preserve peace through strength. But deterrence alone will sow the seeds for conflicts, or even make it inevitable, especially on critical issues for China, such as Taiwan. That's why reassurance is needed to manage the contentious process. Reassurance based on strategic calculus is essential to maximize U.S. national interest while avoiding derailment and war. It does not preclude deterrence. I would argue they're the two sides of the same coin, but both are required for an effective China strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but very much not least, Jason, in Singapore, your final 2 minutes arguing against today's motion.
China respects strength. It is clear that reassurance alone is not enough when dealing with an assertive and increasingly assertive China. It views reassurances without deterrence as a sign of weakness and opportunities to further its strategic ambitions. The only way to effectively manage China's ambition and rise, maintain stability in the Indo-Pacific, and project U.S. interests as well as those of its allies, including Taiwan, is through a balanced approach that prioritizes deterrence while leaving the door open for strategic engagement and diplomacy. Deterrence must be the foundation of U.S. strategy in assuring that China understands that there are clear and significant costs to any aggressive actions, particularly concerning Taiwan and regional security. Reassurance, in contrast, should be used tactically to de-escalate specific tensions and cooperate on issues of mutual interest, but never at the expense of weakening U.S. and its allies' strategic positioning. And I offer some of the suggestions to the upcoming administrations. The U.S. should work through international institutions to counterbalance China's influence in assuring international rules and norms around trade, security, and human rights are upheld. Strengthening allies, such as through NATO's engagement with Indo-Pacific partners or enhancing ASEAN cooperations, could assure China that U.S. and its allies are committed to a rule-based order, not confrontation for its own sake. The next U.S. administration must articulate a clear and coherent China policy that integrates both deterrence and reassurance. Confusing or inconsistent messages will lead to miscalculated by China and erode U.S.'s credibility. This means reaffirming alliances, promoting multilateralism, and ensuring that both China and the international community understand U.S.'s strategic goals. Deterrence to maintain peace and stability, and reassurance to avoid unnecessary conflict, and diplomacy to manage competition. The next U.S. administration should approach China with a strategy grounded in deterrence as the primary pillar, supported by selective reassurance and engagement. This balanced approach will ensure that U.S. remains strong in the face of Chinese assertiveness while leaving space for operations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jason. And that concludes today's Oxford debate. All there is left to do is for you, the audience, to vote. I'm going to start now the second poll, which is the same as the first poll. You're asked to agree or disagree with today's motion, which is the next U.S. administration must reassure China, not just deter it. And I'm now looking towards my colleagues who tell me that the results are ready. So we're putting them on the screen. I have not seen them myself, but let's take a look. So before the debate, 69% of you agreed with the motion, 14% disagreed, and 17% didn't know. After the debate, 71% agreed with the motion, 22% disagreed with the motion, which means, and that is unusual, both teams gained points, but the team arguing against the motion, that is James Crabtree and Jason Su, has gained just a little bit more, which means you are officially declared the winner of this debate. Congratulations to the two of you. And of course, thank you to Rorry and to Yunsen as well for joining us. This was indeed very, very close.